Keep left, and then turn left. Turn left. Keep right. Okay, let's find a new route. Go straight on.
And almost like a concurrent experiment with their neighbours, Norway and Denmark, who are going into full lockdown, and they aren't doing that. I don't think anyone quite knows how that's going to play out. Do you like the Swedish response to this crisis, Kitty?
Well, obviously, on a kind of human level, it sounds more pleasant. But I think the main point is that we simply don't know what's needed. And I think if I was in government, I would rather be safe than sorry. So they're looking like an outlier. But I'm sure all three of us, being, kind of policy wonks to a greater or lesser extent, just kind of feels that the data is going to be fascinating, in a few years' time, when we can sort of do cross-country analysis and see what the difference actually was from these different experiments. Sometimes it feels wrong to get excited about data when it's such a kind of horrible health issue, but
the data is loss of life, isn't it?
PhD thesis, I'm sure, on the various different policies from various different governments.
What's your take on it, Amelia?
It's interesting, isn't it? He's advocated, Anders Tegnell, the chief epidemiologist, a very much softer approach. He's still on the sort of strategy of mitigation, which makes me think they're sort of where Britain felt it was maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, back at sort of stage 1. The idea is to be much more cautious, allowing the virus to spread slowly without overwhelming the health system, and yet without necessarily the sort of huge sort of draconian shutdowns as well. It sounds like herd immunity, but I obviously he would rip off that as well, and is not indulging in that. It does seem that they are using a precautionary principle. I hate to say it, but they're putting the economy first. They're not necessarily, I think, putting lives first. Now, I mean, this is a different way to do it. They feel that, people's welfare, people's well-being, people's mental health, and the entire ability of a contemporary state to rebound is predicated on the strength of the economy. And if there are lives that have to be sacrificed to make that happen, it seems that this is the approach this government's willing to take. I think what is interesting is the concept of immunity passports. And we were kind of just flirting with this idea in the last conversation, the idea of a certificate that declares that someone's no longer at risk of contracting the coronavirus because they already have it or they've already had it, and it exempts holders from restrictions on activity imposed to contain the spread of the virus. Now, I think this is what Sweden possibly is trying as a sort of halfway house between not shutting down the economy completely, and also not, shutting everybody up in quarantine either. So it's a sort of, it's a bridge actually. It's like the bridge between Copenhagen and Malmo, for which Sweden is so famously known. I think I share Kitty's unease at this. It seems a little unnerving. It might look nice from the humanist perspective, but I think the precautionary principle should have kicked in by now.
It's a huge risk, isn't it, Lynn?
It is a risk. It's also an interesting lesson for us, of course. The politics of this is interesting in Sweden. It's been the centre-left in Sweden that, for the most part, that's wanted a more live and let live strategy, and the centre-right that's been calling for a lockdown, sort of the inverse of what we've seen here, where Boris Johnson has come under attack by the centre-left for wanting to keep the economy moving, if you like. So I think Sweden shows, just at a sort of human level, that decent people can have different views about how you go about doing something. Kitty talks about the data. I don't think we're ever really going to untangle this data, much as I'd like to eyeball good data now and in the weeks and months to come, because different countries are reporting in different ways, dying from coronavirus and dying with coronavirus. I think the UK is very much erring on the side of, if somebody's got coronavirus when they die, then they died from coronavirus. Whereas there's been reports that in Sweden, it's been in the other way around. There are reports in recent days in the Swedish press about that. Also, Norway's gone for hard lockdown. And while the death rate in Sweden is much lower than in sort of, the Central European and the bigger European economies, Norway's had a lockdown, and pro rata, Norway has a much lower death rate than Sweden. Much as I love Sweden, a country I've visited many times and spent a lot of time there, Stockholm is not the global city that London or even Paris or Berlin is. And, our national numbers are driven by London. The fact that, you've got 3 of the busiest airports in the world are in London. Is it any wonder that we are particularly exposed? Stockholm just is not in that league in terms of its connections with the rest of the global economy. So obviously, I hope that all the European countries come out of this. I say again, it's fantastic. We really need to notice this, that the death rate in Italy, fingers crossed, now seems to have peaked and is coming down. I suspect that's not the case, with all respect, in Sweden.
So, good week or bad week for Sweden and their coronavirus policy, Kitty?
Oh, that's quite tricky. I think I'd probably say bad week.
Amelia?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Bad week.
Liam?
I mean, I want everyone to be fine, so I'm going to say good week.
But bad week just about has it, unfortunately. The Queen will be addressing the nation at 8 o'clock, so that's in about 9 minutes' time. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about footballers. The Premier League tried to get their footballers to take a 30% pay cut. That got kicked out by the Players' Union, the PFA. They said that if players didn't get paid, the NHS would suffer because millions would be lost in tax. Any sympathy for the footballers or the clubs or the PFA in this situation, Kitty?
I think they definitely made a mistake with that tax line. I don't think that kind of works. But I do actually have a little bit of sympathy for them. Now, with lots of caveats, I have a bit of sympathy because my understanding is that they are simply keeping to their contracts, which are freely entered into by both sides. And if they want to make personal donations, as I'm sure so many millions of us are in our own ways, that fundamentally should be their choice rather than having a kind of witch hunt and going, oh, you're really rich, you should give more. So I don't really like the witch hunt element of it. But I hope that everyone gives what they can, whether it's time or money, regardless of their wealth position. And I'm sure everyone agrees with that. But having said that, to say we have to earn loads so that we can pay loads of tax doesn't work. Need a bit more professional communications advice on that line, I suspect.
I think that the timing of this has probably been quite bad as well, because I know that Jordan Henderson, the Liverpool captain, had been speaking to the captains of the other Premier League teams effectively to organise a kind of whip round and organise a donation to the NHS to support the fight about the coronavirus, but this all came out before that had been settled. So it's kind of tricky because it feels like footballers are being a bit demonised here, but they're just a bit of an easy target, aren't they, Liam?
They are an easy target, but then on the other hand, so many of these football clubs, they're so important to the communities where they're based. And as somebody who's followed football avidly my whole entire sentient life, I do think something is broken in football in terms of the links with communities, try as some clubs do. I think particularly smaller clubs in towns rather than cities, lower down the leagues, they're the ones that are really going to suffer here.
Yeah.
So rather than going after individual footballers, I agree with Kitty, there's a touch of the witch hunt about that. I think they should be morally pressured into making donations. I think that's completely fair game given what they earn for not working particularly hard, frankly. But rather than going after individual footballers, I think we should be looking to the Premier League to be not only making donations to local communities, particularly the NHS, but looking down the leagues to the smaller clubs, to making sure that they're okay, many of whom are already right on the breadline, given the extent to which the Premier League has just hoovered up all the money in football and audiences over recent years. So there's going to be a complete configuration in British politics after this in many ways. I'm not sure which way it will go. It may be that a lot of the identity politics that has dominated the airwaves for recent years suddenly looks a lot less important when you have so many companies on their knees and when you have unemployment up at 6, 7, 8%, even worse, hopefully not, once we come out of this. And similarly in football, we've had a very, very kind of feudal system in football in recent years where it's been not just winner takes all, that's what sport's about, but where the big league clubs have hoovered up so much of the money, and maybe this is a moment for the reconfiguration of that to begin.
Bit of redistribution, maybe.
Yeah.
Amelia, I feel like Carl Walker probably needs to donate some money, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so. why not?
I think it's a good play for him to donate quite a big old chunk
very
now.
Good indeed.
Yeah, that'll be well spent.
Point about the Premier League, exactly. We don't want to demonise. I think they need, like everybody, we need to find an opportunity to be generous. And the idea perhaps of each team, particularly the regional teams, supporting a hospital, choose a hospital, choose a charity, choose your local branch, support collectively the NHS doing the work in your particular region. I think that would probably take the sting out of what might seem, at first glance, and I think mathematically clearly is a deep inequity in terms of salaries. I think all I need to say is footballers and nurses. And I'll just leave it at that because you can see the difference.
I can. Good week or bad week for footballers, Kitty?
I think bad week.
Yeah, Liam?
Bad.
Amelia?
Bad too, yep.
Definitely a bad week. Absolutely no question there. After 2 weeks stuck at home now, is boredom a problem? Not, according to Sandy Mann, the author of The Science of Boredom, Why Boredom is Good. She carried out experiments on boredom with volunteers and told 5 Live that boredom could actually lead to a great growth in creativity.